We are looking at both, and that's in a way one main challenge, and this is the reason why, if you look at the first slide, my co-author Tor Opsahl is a social network analyst, and we took him on board because the problem of finding a way to put in the same measure the number of ties and the strength of those ties is a significant challenge. So he has written a paper, has published a paper, two papers in 2009 and 2010, that essentially allow us to have a particular way of identifying the relative importance of the number of links and the intensity of links that can be captured to a parameter called alpha parameter. By changing this alpha parameter, you are attributing more importance to the number of links. So as alpha goes to 0, you are only interested in how many links a state has, regardless of the intensity of those links. While if you switch the alpha parameter towards 1, you are only interested in the weight of the links, so the total weight of the links, without looking at the number of links. So we have been essentially presenting our results based on various values of alpha. We don't find basically centrality is important at all levels of alpha that we have been looking at, but the question of which level of alpha is better, which is related to the question of whether it is better to have many weak ties or fewer strong ties, is still something we are looking at.
Your argument is very persuasive, and as a result, I would like you to speculate a little bit on where this kind of research would eventually lead. If these networks are very important and lead to positive results in development, whose responsibility is it to foster these kind of networks moving forward?
Well, the first point is that our results would say that the networks matter, but they are not very important, in the sense that the benefits of increasing linkages within those networks are relatively modest. If you look at the difference between, if you essentially put in our regression equation with the coefficients that we found, if you put the look at the difference between the least networked state, the least central state, and the most central state, for instance, in the IGO network, you find that basically child mortality goes down from about 55 per 1,000 to 45 per 1,000. And this effect is from the two extremes. It is an effect, and of course it matters, but it's not. Networks are not the revolutionary solution to the problem of development. It is part of a solution, and I would say that what matters in terms of policy implications is perhaps more the fact that the anxiety over what is called aid proliferation and aid fragmentation is excessive. If you speak to practitioners today, it seems that one of the main tasks of the development aid industry is to make aid less fragmented. You need to have donors need to have recipients that have fewer donors, with donors that specialize more in certain sectors. That seems to be an imperative. We did not find any evidence that this matters. If anything, having more donors is better than having fewer donors. So the main policy implication in this sense is don't go down the reducing proliferation, reducing fragmentation agenda, because this is not an effective way of improving health aid. With regard to the other findings, as I said, having more connections to INGOs and IGOs is important, and here the argument is that there should be a particular investment in capacity building for those officials to participate in international networks. So there needs to be money put on the side specifically for network activities, and those activities are often considered a little bit of a waste of time. Those officials make expensive travels, to Paris, Brussels, Geneva, and that's a way essentially perks for the job. I think this view doesn't quite actually reflect the more hidden. Sometimes those officials might not even be completely aware of the effects of networking, but they are there. And so again, a policy implication is that part of the development funding should be devoted to integrate officials more closely in networks.
When we're talking about global health, it's obvious the global policymaking is contributing, and we have tools that we can measure the results. You have some rates and some other tools. But if we switch to the global security, a kind of policy area, I'm not sure about the weak ties and strong ties can resolve the same situation, and the communication, it's obviously lacking most of the time, but sometimes there's a lot of communication, like WikiLeaks does. So how do you see your analysis in terms of global security?
I think that adapting this framework to global security is more difficult because health is an area where there is very little perception of competition. In the sense that if a country improves child mortality rates, no other countries is considering this as a problem. You know, it's only welcome in a way, and it only has positive repercussions. The problem in which security problems are defined is that they are much more of a mix between, you know, competitive goals and collaborative goals. Of course, security creates, you know, lots of incentives for collaboration. You want to prevent crisis because this might be having spillover effects, refugees, and so on. You don't want nuclear technologies to fall in the wrong hands, and so on. Of course, you want to prevent, you know, nuclear wars and so on. But also, there is a strong element of competition. So, if the other country at some point feels that it is more secure, this is not necessarily perceived as beneficial by other countries. And so finding an indicator of security which is as consensual as child mortality would be a major challenge. Having said that, we can still in principle say that some issues like the outbreak of ethnic wars could be considered as a commonly shared goal, more or less, by everyone. But in this case, it would be very difficult to identify exactly what kind of transmission of information would produce that outcome. In the sense that political scientists are not very good in finding solutions to ethnic wars. You know, there is a debate about consortional institutions that reduce security dilemma among ethnic groups, for instance, but the findings are quite contested. It's not clear whether, for instance, partition or consortialism is more effective. And this is quite different from what happens in the health field. And so perhaps the effect would go more towards normative transmission. So basically, the short answer to your question, it's very tough to identify something parallel to health policy that would apply also to security. But having said that, there are studies, for instance, Alastair Ian Johnston has done studies about the integration of China in the global security institutions, and is more or less making the same kind of argument, which is that states that are socialized into understanding that, for instance, security is something collective rather than purely competitive, has had an impact on what those policies are domestically. So it's not purely a cosmetic change in words, but it also has some reflections on the actual policy making changes. So there is a literature that addresses that, but not using our methods.
Do you think that the methods from you regard to global health could be transferred to AML or financial?
I think that it can be quite easily adapted to similar issue areas like education policy. What kind of what kind of policies would increase the number of essentially children that complete primary or secondary education? So that would be relatively easy. In the case of financial regulation, it is a little bit more tricky because networks also tend to spread, of course, bad ideas, in the sense that you need to have confidence that the marketplace of ideas works in certain domains, and there are good reasons to think that this is the case in health policy, but it might not necessarily be the case in the case of financial regulation. And I'm thinking, for instance, the issue of capital standards for banks, which was the result of networking done mainly in the Basel Committee for Banking Regulation. And there are some people that argue that this kind of network effect had a positive effect, in the sense that the financial crisis of 2008 would have been even worse without those Basel standards. But on the other hand, you can argue that perhaps without those network effects, capital standards would have been higher and speculative behavior would have been reduced. So in that case, in the case of financial regulation, it might be one of the hard cases for this approach. Maybe not quite as security, because there is less of a competitive element, but there is still sufficiently a competitive element to make the situation blurred. So essentially, it depends on the issue area that we are talking about. The more you go towards the developmental side of things, the more this approach would be fruitful, I think. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, so basically, as long as there's no competition, you can apply it.
I would say competition is one element. Competition makes the application of this framework more difficult, but it's not the only element. I also think that there is something about path dependency, in the sense that I think that in the health sector there is probably less path dependency than, for instance, in financial regulation, in the sense that the number of the role of ideas is higher relatively to the role of material incentives, and incentives for people to continue to essentially have the same kind of regulation regardless of arguments that it is not effective. And this is something that is stronger in the financial sector than in the health sector. I'm not saying it's not there in the health sector. I'm just making a relative argument.
I understand. So you're saying that only health and education, nothing else can really work?
I think it works in every possible sector, including security, but probably it works less the more you are at the security at the competitive level. But I would even say it partly depends on issues within issues. For instance, the question of intellectual property protection is a sub-issue of the trade agenda, but it's one issue in which there has been a shift towards understanding, for instance, that intellectual property protection should not apply to medicines in the way that it applies to other products. And I think this is partly the result of international networks of activists that mobilized in the 1990s and diffused a particular conception, a particular set of ideas until it was taken up by the WTO.
Can I piggyback on that, Matthias? Mine's a very naive question. I just want to know how you answer it. You spoke earlier in terms of the problem of complexity is that with regard to thinking governance in terms of networks and increasing complexification there,
Yeah, I mean that's a very tricky question, and I must say at the beginning I don't have an answer to that question, in the sense that I suppose my argument here could be interpreted to support a more technocratic position, and saying there are lots of networks, the organizations that we have been looking at, nobody knows about them. You know, it's people might have heard about the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, and a few others, but these are essentially networks in the health domain of expert specialists that make important decisions that have major impacts on the health of populations, on child mortality, without people really being aware of that. And so we are talking about ways in which policies are shifted, adjusted, below the radar screen of public accountability to some extent. And health is a particularly tricky situation, partly because when health becomes a matter of politicization, so to speak, and becomes a political issue, often the outcomes are pretty bad. Just to give you one example, one of those networks that I'm talking about is centered around the Global Polio Eradication Initiative that has been vaccinating against polio children since the late 80s, and there have been basically hundreds of millions of children that were vaccinated against polio as a result of the networking produced by this organization. There have been a few cases where essentially the goal of polio vaccination has become subject of political debate, and in particular a case where many Nigerian leaders, political leaders, especially of northern states in Nigeria, started opposing polio vaccination because some parts of the community were convinced that these polio vaccines that were used were essentially harmful, that they were used to spread AIDS, that there were actually a way in which Western powers were making Muslims infertile and so on. And this sentiment has been picked up by political leaders that obstacled polio vaccination. This is something that happened in the early 2000s. As a result of that, polio had already been eliminated by several West African countries, but because it spread again in Nigeria, there were at least 30 countries that became reinfected of polio as a result of this politicization. So in this sense, you have a case perhaps where political leaders became more sensitive to public opinion in this sense, but reacted in a way that were contrary to the way that technocrats were perceiving the issue. But having said that, on the other hand, you could argue that polio eradication itself as a goal is a distortion of health priorities, because essentially it targets a disease that is not a priority concern for developing countries, and therefore if there had been more democratic accountability in terms of priority setting in global health, more resources would have been directed, instead of directing them on polio that has absorbed an absolutely disproportionate amount of resources compared to other diseases in terms of the actual burden that it imposes on population. If you have created a system that was more, in a way, democratic, accountable, then polio eradication would not have been set as a goal, and for instance, more money had been spent on respiratory diseases in developing countries that are causing, 100 times more deaths than polio. So on the one hand, you see that in some cases, politicization is a serious problem, and I could give you other examples, but in other cases, you could argue that when it comes to priority setting, these networks are too kind of fixated on their own priorities, and they are not following what in a well-organized democratic state would be a weighing of different priorities against each other that is the result of the normal working of politics, of democratic politics, which is far from perfect, but it allows to say, okay, how are we going to distribute scarce resources over alternative uses? and how are we going to be accountable for the decisions that we are making. So, as I say, I don't have an answer to that question, but the question of accountability is a double-edged sword in a way.
I mean, returning from the global to a regional or national level, you'd obviously have no problem with this. Again, I'd just like to hear your immediate reaction. One can argue that sort of whether one calls it state building or development in Afghanistan has been an extraordinary failure because there has been too diffuse number of agencies working and very clear lack of coordination at non-military levels and between the non-military and the military. And one of the reasons was precisely because the American military, both within NATO and outside NATO, were not willing to cede sovereignty to the UN on questions of logistical coordination. With regard to that, when I'm listening to you, and again, I could be just to one side of your concerns, and I'm quite aware of it. It would seem to me that what is precisely needed in terms of global governance is a certain amount of centralization. In order for these networks to be not simply accountable, but also logistically coordinated in order for outcomes to be possible in the first place. Would you accept that with regard to specific issues in areas like Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, my tendency to say I can see the both sides of an argument, and it becomes an empirical question to see whether the benefits of centralization outweigh the costs of centralization in this sense. So in a way, my data in particular don't, because you don't have a world state basically, my data are unable to tell you what would happen if you have higher levels of coordination at the international level. But what my data say is that if a country depends on a smaller number of donors for its development aid, and remember that some developing countries, in some cases in the health sector, 30% of resources for health come from international development aid. If a donor depends on a fewer number of countries, then it tends to do worse than if it has a more fragmented level of countries. In an additional analysis, what we did, I didn't talk about that, because our databases allow us to measure the degree of coordination of aid. So we are able to separate the aid that is given in a non-coordinated fashion directly to projects, or aid that is given for supporting the health sector as a whole, so giving it to the ministry, and this is something that donors are shifting towards doing and saying, look, we put all the money in one pot, and then we have more coordination about where that money goes, rather than us funding our pet projects, in a more fragmented way. When we take the component of aid out that is coordinated, all our results basically are robust. They don't change. So it's not the coordinated component of aid that does the job of explaining why networks, more complex networks, have a positive effect. And in this sense, in these cases, there might well be, I'm not saying that there are no negative effect of complexity. There are definitely negative effects, but they are just outweigh or offset by the positive effect. Whether something similar can be said in the case of Afghanistan, I'm not completely sure. I could imagine reasons why having a more hierarchical organization might be less susceptible to adapting intervention to local circumstances, while a more fragmented system is able to pick up variations, local variations, and able to diffuse innovations better. So if local commanders do certain things, if you have a more centralized system, innovation might be discouraged, or when innovation happens, it's not diffused in the system as if you have competing centers of power. So if the US and the UN compete, there is very little hierarchical arrangement within them. It might well be that it's more difficult to keep quiet when somebody does something new, because the other unit might adopt that innovation and see whether it works. So I'm not in a way venturing an opinion on the mission on Afghanistan, but I can imagine ways in which decentralization can be beneficial in that setting as well.
Centralization, do you think that the centralization that the UN did with Cambodia, the transition authority, was any help to the country, knowing how they left the country in pieces?
I'm afraid I don't know enough about the case of Cambodia. I'm pretty sure that usually, even if you have a UN setting, generally because the UN is dependent on both national troops and national officials, the level of heterogeneity would probably still be pretty high. You would have, commanders of US troops and national officials that would come from different levels, from different backgrounds, and they would probably, recommend different ways of doing things, and this might well be a positive thing, or it might be a negative thing, we don't know. But it would be worthwhile to do a study of that. It would be difficult to design, but you could look at different policy sectors in Cambodia and see whether those sectors that have more heterogeneity were also those that were, less worse in a way. Or you could look at different districts in Cambodia and see whether districts that were based on higher levels of centralization had better results in terms of reconstructions, getting children to school, building up health systems, and so on. So my question is, it's an empirical question that deserves very careful study.
Yeah, we just left election, and the guys like that never became prime minister.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but you see, the point of a research design is to try to guess what would have happened if things had been in a way that they have not been. So you're trying to essentially, there is an alternative universe, and you should say, if the UN had behaved differently, would things have been worse or better? And it's very difficult to know essentially what this counterfactual would be. And so the fact that things are bad doesn't mean that it was the UN that made them bad. They could have been bad for other reasons. So that would be my answer, not knowing the Cambodia case particularly well. I mean, this is why we have essentially social science. We try to, in a way, find methods to get around this fundamental problem that we cannot directly observe a world that has not taken place.
I know that the general idea of the project is that increased contact brings increased innovation, but is there any evidence to show that increased interconnectivity actually causes groupthink or disseminating one kind of idea and suppressing perhaps other innovations that could have been produced?
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right. And there is some research, not at the level of policymakers, but at the level of, in companies where this groupthink effect has been shown to work. So sometimes it's isolated nodes that are more innovative. But the problem that we have is isolated nodes might be more innovative, but then are those innovations diffused to other nodes or not? So if we were able to find a way to, in a way, identify, the innovators, then we probably would be able to tease out the effect of competition and innovation. But unfortunately, we have not found a way of doing it. I mean, we are looking at these outcomes, but we are aware that those outcomes mask very major, they mask tendencies that work against each other. So partly the fact that we find an effect, but this effect is not great, doesn't mean that the mechanism we we study are not very important, but they might to some extent neutralize each other. So as you say, on the one hand, innovation might be produced by more interaction, but on the other hand, you need to prevent groupthink and the complete diffusion of one model, and then the model becomes so dominant that innovation is discouraged. Both mechanisms might work, and our data seem to suggest that one mechanism works stronger than the other. But I mean, I think it's a very important point, yes.
Would you be willing to apply your model, though it's a very flexible model, to something like climate change mitigation and adaptation?
I suppose, yeah, that's one of the, yeah, I think that could be one of the areas where this methodology could be applied. More generally to environmental policy, but more specifically on policies that are directed towards climate change. Yeah. Thank you very much.